My name is Dr. G. Welcome to That's Unusual, my podcast uncovering the unusual stories behind the world's most interesting people. On this show, we celebrate what makes us different and how we convert those differences into unexpected opportunities. Welcome to this week's episode of That's Unusual. A big shout out to the thousands of listeners who tune in each week. If you haven't done so yet, be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher so you don't miss an episode. Does our government need radical reforming? That's the big question for today. On today's episode, world-renowned geopolitical strategist and 5 times best-selling author Dr. Parag Khanna shares insights from his latest book, Technocracy in America, for a radical overhaul of the U.S. government system. Dr. Khanna draws upon his personal experiences as a global citizen, having traveled and studied dozens of political systems from around the globe. On this episode, Parag and I discuss how our current system has failed us, why technocrats are better served to effect change in an administration, why the office of the presidency needs checks and balances with an executive oversight committee, his ideas on why the Senate and House need to be radically reconfigured as an assembly of governors, and much, much more. In light of the recent transition of power in the White House, the timing of this conversation could not be more relevant. Regardless of what side of the aisle you sit on, we can all agree that it's about time we rethink how our government operates to serve the people's needs. This conversation was eye-opening for me, and I hope it stirs up some unusual perspectives for you as well. Before we get started, I have a very, very special gift for you. I'm giving away 50 free, yes, free Kindle edition copies of Parag's latest book, Technocracy in America, for the first 50 people to newly subscribe to this podcast and here's the kicker, to leave a review on iTunes. To redeem your book, you must send me an email at info@drgautamgulati.com. That's info@drgautamgulati.com with a copy of the review you posted on iTunes. It's as simple as that. So don't wait, go now, subscribe, leave a review, and send me an email to get your free copy before they run out. As you listen to this episode, I ask as usual for you to reflect on your own unusual stories and unique qualities that can help open doors to unexpected opportunities. And so with that, let's get started. Welcome to the show, Parag. Great to have you here.
Great to talk to you, Gautam.
I understand you're joining us all the way from Singapore. Is that correct?
That is right. My new home, sweet home, I guess you could say.
Yeah, world traveler, global citizen. I'm just fascinated by following a lot of the adventures and stories that you capture along the way. You and I first hung out and met while we were in New York City, living together there. And I recall going to your first book launch for The Second World way back in the day. You've come quite a ways since then, having written now 5 books, if not more, best-selling books, not, to say the least. And the most recent one, of course, being Technocracy in America, Rise of the Infostate. And I got to say, I picked up a copy of this, and I think everyone's probably grabbing copies of this book because of the timing of it, given the election of Donald Trump as our president of the United States. And everyone's really just questioning our governmental process. And so I really, today's conversation is really just to sort of dig deep into this book and your radical thesis in this book, because I think that alone is unusual enough. I think it's a very different perspective that I think is really important to have sort of a world discussion and really reevaluate, some of our government. So with that, tell us about your thought process behind Technocracy in America.
Yeah. So, first of all, you're making me super nostalgic going back to that first book party from 10 years ago. Well, almost up to 10 years since my first book. And, I view it as just one long stream of consciousness that now totals a couple of thousand pages, basically.
I do feel like that. Having read all of your books, there is a common thread that comes through each one of them. I think every one of them builds upon each other.
Oh, cool. Yeah. As does life, and I think that since I'm not a natural writer, I don't sort of go out of my way to construct things with a certain kind of identity that isn't me. The style evolves as I do, and each one obviously has its own set of messages. So technocracy in America, interestingly enough, and this is something I go to great pains to emphasize, is not some slapdash effort that I decided to do once Donald Trump was suddenly looking like a serious candidate. To the contrary, I wrote the entire thing in 2014 and 2015. And it was the final section of the Connectography book, the big fat one that came before this. And that book was so thick and so long that we literally had to cut an entire book out of it. And that book was about, because Connectography was about global complexity and connectivity and so forth, the final section was meant to be about, well, what kind of government could do the best job of coping with this complexity? And the answer was something that mixes democracy, as we think of it, with technocracy, which is kind of using experts and data to filter and strategize about the future. And so I wrote the whole thing. And then as Trump was and we cut it out of Connectography, and we're like, and I was like, I've got a whole book here about American governance and how to do it right. And the book has almost no reference. You can validate this for all your listeners. The book has almost zero reference to Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. I mentioned their names maybe 2 or 3 times max. So when Trump won, I barely changed a word, so help me God. Barely changed a syllable, because I was trying to I have written a book that is not about personalities and not about politics. It's about the system. And what I try to construct is a kind of government that doesn't exactly exist in the world today. But if it did, it would be the best kind of government for this hyper complex world that's becoming overly populist and short term and narrow minded and, with divided societies. And that is what I'm calling this direct technocracy, a mix of kind of Switzerland's much praised model of direct democracy, where the citizens have a say in everything, and the Singapore model of technocracy, which is where experts who are superbly well trained consult using big data analysis and obviously listening to voters in elections. And they do really long-term planning better than any other country in the world. So you take those two systems, you mash them up, and you get technocracy in America. So, the book studies those countries and a lot of others, and then it applies it to America.
Yeah, I think that thread is so incredible. And the fact that you'd already sort of forecasted this change and the need for this change, even in advance of the election, is extremely timely and highly relevant. Can you just sort of take a step back just for our listeners who may not be as familiar with the concept of technocracy? I'm sure we understand, a lot of them understand democracy. They understand, bureaucracy, meritocracy. How would you define a technocrat? Like, what in your word is a technocrat?
Right. It's a great question, actually, because a lot of people right now are saying to themselves, this Trump election was a rejection of the notion of technocracy. It was a rejection of those law professors running our government, right? Those out of touch elites. Well, I just need to say this. If technocracy or technocrats and elites were synonyms, then I would just use the word elites. I wouldn't need a fancy word like technocracy. So technocracy is something different from a bunch of law professors running the country, right? Technocracy is actually a centuries old kind of notion. It really goes back to the sort of Prussian style of government with strong bureaucracy, the kind of state that Max Weber praised in the 19th century. Even actually the French, after the French Revolution, set up their whole system of the elite sort of training academies, the École Nationale Supérieure, was meant to be the sort of, elite training grounds for administrators who could really run the country well. And then, of course, you could go back to Plato, quite frankly, as I do in the book, and many others have, and look at the role of the guardians, right? This sort of elite or aristocratic class who was capable of thinking in a long-term fashion about the best interests of society as a whole. So there are many traditions that you bring together in this notion of technocracy. But here, let's just bring it up to the 21st century. Bottom line. Elites are just smart people with fancy degrees, right? A technocrat is a smart person with a fancy degree who also knows how to run something, who knows how to run a big agency with thousands of employees, who knows how to manage budgets of billions of dollars, right? So just because you have a Nobel Prize and, Obama appointed you to cabinet, it doesn't mean you know how to run government agency, right? And that is very often the case in American government. Cabinet appointees or other officials, the 4,000 federal appointees come into office and they don't necessarily know how to get things done. Technocrats are intelligent, but they also know how to get things done. So we have very few technocrats in America.
Does it require them, in your view, does it require them to have to understand how to run a governmental agency or just any sort of large organization or company?
Oh, that's a great question, of course. So, we're talking obviously about how to fix the government. So ideally, people have some experience running a large a government agency or having worked their way up the ranks rather than just come in from the outside, having been nothing but a trust fund baby, or something, which is the case with some members of the cabinet. So take a guy like Rex Tillerson. He's run the largest oil company on the planet Earth. He's now taking over the State Department. The State Department is a lot smaller than Exxon. So from a managerial standpoint, and its budget is like, a thousandth of Exxon's revenues, right? So, you've got a situation where administratively, he's the right guy. He's perfectly capable of doing the job. He obviously doesn't know much about its structure, and that's definitely a downside. And of course, he doesn't have experience in government. That's a downside. There's pluses and minuses.
But wouldn't that put us into somewhat of the same trap? Because there's a saying that goes, politicians aren't born, they're made. That everyone goes into politics with the intentions of ultimately, serving the higher calling, but ultimately politics gets in the way and they sort of become these bureaucratic, individuals. So if somebody were to come through the system, would that change them ultimately? Do we need somebody who, completely from the outside who wasn't or hasn't been tainted or morphed into what the political system makes them to be?
It's a great question. Look, there's no reason for a system to exclude people from the outside. In a way, I am quite damning of career politicians, right? People who have done nothing but represent. I think perhaps maybe even the most important sentence of the book is that America has a great surplus of representatives, right? Senators and congressmen, and a great deficit of administrators, people who are like governors and mayors. So let's be clear, there's nothing wrong with people being, careerists per se, but they need to do more than just represent special interests or even just dutifully represent the interests of their people. They need to know how to govern. And governance is something that may come from a private sector background or a public sector background, but it's a particular kind of skill that we underrate. We think, I can go in and, knock heads together and run the show and I can fix things up. Well, we've got generations of evidence to the contrary. You can't just show up and fix things. You've got to know how systems work. You've got to know the process of governance. You've got to know how resources move from point A to point B. It's like they say in the military, strategy is for amateurs, logistics is for professionals. It's a good analogy there to how the kind of people we need in politics or in governance as well.
So, given the timing of the election, and just for those who are listening, we're about 3 weeks into President Trump's election into the White House. I mean, you now see some of the members that he's picking for his cabinet, how the administration is functioning, how he's been putting forth executive orders. What, in your view, ultimately, knowing what's happening today, I mean, are there elements of technocracy built into what he's built in his cabinet? Or would you do it differently?
Not exactly.
I mean, would you consider like Rex Tillerson somebody as a technocrat?
Well, so it's safe to say that basically no one, in Trump's cabinet would be sort of a technocrat in the sense of being the most qualified person, both administratively and in terms of knowledge base for their job. So, I mean, Tillerson is not necessarily a bad choice. He knows the world. He literally knows the sort of, the energy geography of the planet, and obviously he's run a large bureaucracy. But diplomacy and what he's practiced is a very important form of diplomacy, corporate diplomacy. But, the diplomacy of the United States covers a whole range of issues, obviously science, technology, human rights, law. These are not exactly his fortes. In many other countries, you would choose someone to be Secretary of State who has a very wide-ranging set of experiences with previous portfolios that do cover those issues, and also has run some other large bureaucracy or was previously the deputy or something like that. Let's take an example that even more people may be familiar with. It's Ben Carson, right? Here's a guy who's a surgeon, a doctor, who kind of makes things up as he goes along, who's now been named Secretary for Housing and Urban Development. He doesn't know anything about housing or about urban development. Now, this is, literally the most important job in America right now is affordable housing. Quite frankly, it's the most important issue in every country in the world is affordable housing. So you take a complete neophyte. I mean, I don't even know what the hell he's doing there, quite literally. And you just stick him in that job. Like, that's not exactly the way a technocracy operates, right? I mean, I happen to live in this little country called Singapore, and it has by far the world's most robust and sophisticated public housing program. It's literally a well-oiled machine with many, many, many complex moving parts around subsidies and loans and grants and ownership and titles and all of these things. None of those things are applicable right now to a guy like Ben Carson, right? He just doesn't have any clue about how to really, fulfill the mission, if you will, that has been put before him. And he's not going to. He's going to fail. There's just no question that he is going to fail.
Yeah, I mean, that was a very surprise pick. But of course, a lot of favors are being done in the election, for every election, right? Even President Obama and all those who preceded. It's kind of the way it's functioned for a period of time. So, before I get into sort of the infographic, and you sort of laid out a framework and a playbook for how you think the government should be structured, President Trump, does he, to some degree, the fact that he's an elite, but he's, to some degree, some would consider him business savvy, having run organizations, managing a number of people, coming in from the outside, has been involved with local governments from a funding and fundraising standpoint, but not necessarily from an operational standpoint. Would he be considered somebody who would fall into a technocratic role?
There's so many things about being president, right? There's so much knowledge you need to have about domestic and foreign policy, about legal and economic issues that, again, people, if you're honest with yourself, it's obviously dubious whether or not President Obama himself was qualified to be president, right? My bias, and it's not just a bias, I think it's perhaps quite well grounded, is that people who have had significant governance experience, again, not just representative experience, but governance experience, right? So people who have been a governor of a state are going to inherently be better qualified to run the largest bureaucracy on the planet Earth. It's hardly a logical leap. Let's get into this, though, because so
does that make Bill Clinton sort of the last real qualified person to take office because he was the governor of Arkansas and then had some stints?
You had obviously George Bush was governor of Texas, which is one of the largest.
But he also came through the ranks of a family of politicians, right? Which kind of.
So he ticks two boxes, actually, even though he wasn't necessarily a great president. I mean, the hereditary sort of box and the governance box. But remember, there's also the knowledge part. Don't forget that factor, which is obviously not insignificant. He didn't exactly know a whole lot about the world, right? Nor even how to spell many words. So, he wasn't exactly Mr. Technocrat either. But let's get into this because it's not, like I said, I wrote this book without reference to personalities. Because when I was talking about the executive branch in the book, I say that, the Oval Office should really be run like a boardroom and you should have 7 people where it's called a collective presidency. You've got a committee of 7 that together debates these, again, domestic and international economic and military issues and comes to a consensus. There is still a president, right? There is one, first among equals who decides. But these people are with him all day long. They strongly inform his decision-making. And there's a big difference between that kind of system and what we have right now, because you've got one guy who ultimately makes the call, who's basically deciding alone. And the cabinet members are not a collective presidency because a cabinet official in America, a cabinet secretary, is only responsible for one thing, right? They just have to cover their ass on one thing. They don't have skin in the collective game and the success and failure of all policies, healthcare, housing, foreign policy, and so forth. In a collective presidency, it's all for one and one for all. So you've got 7 heads that are better than one. And that, again, is something that, we're nowhere near in the system we have right now.
So in that type of structure, would that mean that every decision essentially has to be a decision made and approved by the committee?
Well, not necessarily made and approved. So if you take, for example, the Swiss system that I talk about a fair bit, they have this kind of collective presidency. And again, you have a 7-person collective executive. You have it's called the Federal Executive Council. And the Federal Executive Council represents 4 different political parties. And so they have to operate according to some consensus, but ultimately they have sort of a majority vote, for example. Mm-hmm. So you could have a system like that. But the point is that it has to be sort of multidisciplinary. It can't just be, my only responsibility is energy and someone else's only responsibility is education and so forth. It's got to be something that's much more integrated. And, again, we don't have that, and there's no evidence to suggest that Trump wants to do anything of the sort. He probably wants to do more a bit of a divide and rule kind of approach where most people are in the dark as to what he's doing, even his own cabinet ministers, while, Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner are making all the decisions.
I was going to say that's probably who he considers his own personal executive committee advisory board.
Yeah, there you go.
Steve Bannon, Jared Kushner, Kellyanne Conway. Hardly an executive committee, but so that's fascinating. The collective presidency, and you mentioned examples being done in Switzerland. Would it work here in the United States? I mean, every country is different. Everyone, Switzerland's obviously from a size standpoint and GDP standpoint is very different from the United States.
So it could work, right? So theoretically, not only could it work, it should work. You should want there to be more than one person juggling all these balls in the air and vetting their ideas, off the sounding board of people who are, quite frankly, much more qualified than oneself, right? So, for example, if it were required that this collective presidency or that the president appoint 6 other people or 10 other people taken from the Senate, the House, the governors, outside experts, they wouldn't just be a loyal echo chamber because they wouldn't want the policies to fail because it would reflect badly on them, right? So you immediately have an incentive for people to give their best possible advice. So it's perfectly plausible that kind of system is what you could sort of develop. But again, there's no evidence. And remember, the word cabinet does not appear in the Constitution, right? So the president can construct it any way he likes. If a wise president comes along and wants to, construct a system that's much more, you could say effective, smarter, then it can be done. But there's just clearly no interest in doing that. And again, part of the problem is that in America, we don't really learn from other governments. We don't study other governments. We really should, but we don't.
Yeah, it's a very good point. You also talk about this other notion, and there's several different radical ideas that you've put in terms of restructuring our government to sort of model or mimic or learn from other governments in other countries. But you talk about reimagining the Senate as a governor's assembly. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of my kind of favorite ideas, if you will, and it's gotten a lot of good feedback, even though it's so radical. I literally say that the Senate should be abolished. And I wouldn't have thought of that myself if I hadn't been reading all of the reportage and analysis that's come out lately that has demonstrated that the Senate has in fact become nothing more than a smaller but more elite version of the House of Representatives. And there's a good reason for that, which is that the Senate used to be made up of former governors. So you've been a governor of a state, you know how to run something again, but your next step up in stature is to move to Washington as a senator. And the Senate was that avuncular body, that's able to, again, think in a long-term way about national governance, that really knows the issues and so forth. But now, instead of the Senate being made up of mostly former governors who are genuinely qualified, it's made up of former congressmen. So now or former representatives. So now instead of one House of Representatives, what you actually have in practice is 2 houses of representatives. And if most people can agree, because public opinion surveys bear this out, they think the House of Representatives is a bunch of, useless crooks, then now you've got 2 such bodies. It's just that the senators happen to be rich but useless crooks. And that's what we've got right now. So the history of this over the last 50, 60 years, it's gone largely unnoticed. but it's obviously validated by very precise fact, which is the number of senators who, again, used to be governors versus those who are now representatives. So you might as well just get rid of it and replace it with this assembly of governors. Now, I have a lot of respect for governors because, again, governors know how to run things. I'll keep on hammering on this point because just being a smart guy really doesn't count for as much anymore as it used to, evidently, right? You've got to know how to get things done. Yeah. And governors do. Governors know how to cooperate. Governors don't just fight for pork barrel spending. Governors are interested in cooperation across states. And I believe that you should have basically two governors for each state. And I suggest in the book it could either be the top two winners in any given gubernatorial election, or it could be two candidates running together on a ticket. And one of them stays in the state capital and the other represents the state in Washington. And they can either, each holds the job for 4 years, 6 years, whatever, or they rotate geography every couple of years. But the point is that they're coordinating with each other what their state's interests are. But the governor who is in Washington is actually coordinating with other governors and learning from them. And they're actually, devising policies that benefit all states. That's just not the way the Senate operates today. You can read and watch, just turn on the television and look at, I don't want to date this conversation too much, but look at what Elizabeth Warren is saying. I'm sure that, a couple of weeks from now, it'll be the same situation. It's become a shit show. And that's to be expected given who is occupying those seats. I assure you this, if you woke up tomorrow morning and the Senate were 100 former governors or 100 actual governors, it would be a really different conversation. And this country would be way better run.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that is all of the concepts that you put in the book. I think that makes certainly the most sense. And I think we'd have completely different outcomes in terms of our policy if that were the case, because they are the doers, right? They're not just the talkers. So all of this stuff, and there's so many other concepts that we can talk about and radical ideas. And I suggest everybody go pick up a copy of this book because it'll certainly at least open your mind to other types of government that are being structured in other countries and how we can apply and learn that and apply that here. So all of this, Parag, great in theory, makes good sense. Ultimately, the people who would have to make this change are the people in the government currently today. So how do you put this? How do you put this in practice? How does this happen?
You do it piece by piece. You don't tackle, there's no grand bargain to get all of this done, right? We're talking about constitutional changes. We're talking about executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch. We're talking about changes across the board. You've got to start somewhere. You start by abolishing electoral college, for example. You can start by having the Supreme Court selection of justices for the Supreme Court done through a bipartisan independent panel that, suggests a slate of nominees rather than this sort of process where it's all about having a justice die on your watch and you get to try and replace him with someone equally, partisan. That's, you can fix these things one by one by one. You can modify the way in which legislation, fiscal policy is allocated or funds are allocated so that infrastructure projects have to cross multiple state lines. The Department of Transportation, the Department of Commerce take 50 different proposals every year for transportation budget spending, whereas they should be taking just 5 or 6 based on the 5 or 6 kind of regional clusters in the country. So there's 1,000 little things you need to do that could start to turn the supertanker in the right direction. There's no off-the-shelf way to do this all at once. I'm not short of making me, king for a day, which, I'm potentially available.
I hope that this certainly seeds it in people's head in terms of, we need a little bit of a wake-up call. We need a change in government. We need to make small steps to do that. I'm not sure if it'll happen with this administration, but certainly I think we can feed the conversation. We need to have more discussions around this. Can you, just take a step back for me in a second? You said that this sort of was the concluding portion of connectography. Connect those dots a little bit. Connectography, very impactful book. And I, even though this book has now taken the surface, I, recommend everybody pick up a copy of Connectography because that truly is how globalization is happening. It's about a connected world. You talk about megacities. Talk about the thread between those two books.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I guess, pardon the pun, a lot of connectivity, between them, because again, they used to be part of the same book, in the manuscript phase for a very good reason. But, when you think about this world of megacities, you think about devolution and the growing autonomy of states. Look at how California is going to fight Trump tooth and nail over everything from the travel ban and sanctuary cities to the wall with Mexico. Those themes were a huge part of connectography. The way in which, if you have universal connectivity, smaller provinces and cities don't depend so much on the capital anymore. They can have their own diplomatic and commercial relationships around the world. So now in Technocracy, I talk a lot about how, and this is actually just building on the previous conversation we were just having about how do you get there from here. Part of the prescription is obviously more empowerment of the local level, right? More empowerment of cities, more empowerment of states to figure out what policies work best for them in their circumstances and to provide the resources for them to do better, basically. So there's a lot of themes that are in common between the two books. And, very fundamentally, it's again about governing in a complex world where everyone is a price taker, to use that kind of phrase from economics. Even America is reactive to world events. So you've got to have a system that is anticipating the future, that's looking at scenarios and trends, that's not just shooting from the hip every single day, which is really what's going on right now.
Yeah, and I think, that connection is extremely important and probably a conversation that we should have for another time and another show. But, today's really focused on current book of Technocracy. But thanks for making that link. Going a little bit off topic here, as we come to sort of the tail end of our conversation, you're a world traveler. And so obviously you've seen perspectives and viewpoints that most in the world have never seen before. In all of your travels, and I think you've traveled, 100, 150 countries, maybe more. What is the most surprising thing that you've seen over the course of your travels?
The most surprising thing, I mean, oh man, the ideas are flooding into my head. I mean, look, the fact is, let me say just a couple of things. First of all, 99% of the people in the world don't wake up every morning wondering, what has Donald Trump done today, right? It's meeting their own basic needs. And that's not just at the individual level, it's countries. Chinese leaders don't wake up in the morning, saying, what am I going to do about American foreign policy and this and that? They've got their own domestic list of priorities. So it's important to hear that because, we've been saying a lot now lately, we've got to rebuild America. The best thing for American foreign policy is to rebuild America at home. Well, guess what? That's why dozens of countries are getting ahead of the U.S. in their domestic performance and quality of life because they've already been doing that. That's one thing that I think is very important. Another is this kind of generational commonality. As a sort of quasi-millennial-ish kind of person, I'm really seeing the sort of common ambitions and desires of the world's youth, no matter what country they come from. And this is now validated by ever more research and public opinion surveys that are showing that young people really value connectivity as much or more than their own nationality. They want sustainability. They want mobility. All of these things are extremely important to the world's youth. And that makes me more optimistic because you've got, for all the protectionism and populism in the West, I'm actually seeing a lot of commonality and vision around the world.
Those are certainly interesting things. Out of my own curiosity here, we tend to have a very egocentric view of America as we live in here, and we think that our view of America is the same as everybody else views America. Being and having a viewpoint from the outside and spoken to a number of people, what is the world's perception of America right now? I mean, are we a laughingstock? Are we an experiment and a case study? Are we a threat? Are we a partner? I mean, what is their perception?
No, it's a great question. I think, look, people are certainly running out of patience. That would be one response, right? Sort of saying, think about all the European countries, for example, that have been cooperating with the U.S. on sanctions with Iran, but hoping that we would start to modify our positions to be much more sort of, pragmatic and kind of, much more willing to engage with Iran in order to actually bring about tangible change rather than just continuing the status quo policies that haven't worked for 40 years. Now you've got a leader in America who you don't even respect, who even many Americans don't respect. Suddenly he's going to be volatile in his policy. And they're going to say, you know what, to hell with him. with all due respect, to hell with you. You have no idea what you're doing. We're a lot smarter than you, and we know how to help change societies. We've, fixed all these former communist states in Eastern Europe over the last 25 years. We know how diplomacy and investment work better than America does, and we're just going to go our own way. And, you literally hear even Angela Merkel saying things like this in her speeches, if you read between the lines. So I think that, we have to start taking very seriously the idea that countries are just going to try to ignore us as much as possible.
Yeah. And I think just, to that point, by focusing, specifically on ourselves as America first, without, having the viewpoints and the perspectives of the impact of other countries around the world, is really just going to give a leg up, an advantage point for other countries to really focus on themselves as well and not have to depend on the United States for their prosperity, which to some degree is going to create a rising power amongst many of the other countries. So it'll certainly be an interesting thing to watch. I think your ideas are so timely. As radical as they are, I think they make very good practical sense. And I hope, the government, the current government, institutions, agencies, everyone sort of takes a listen, at least, to start making those incremental changes. So, with that, I think this is sort of a good segue into sort of getting into my final segment of our call, which is what I ask a lot of our guests to do in the sort of the open, rapid fire Mad Lib questions. So if you're okay with that, we'll jump right into that.
Mad Lib. Love it.
All right, let's do this. All right, so I've got 5 for you. The first one is: the best piece of advice I ever received was?
Best piece of advice is that true knowledge comes from loneliness and reading and reflection and travel. And while I'm not lonely all that much, I do try to spend as much time as possible reading and reflecting, and above all, traveling.
Fantastic. Great. Next one is I'm most curious about?
I'm most curious about, so I'm planning, and you have young kids also who you adore as much as I adore mine. I've got a trip coming up with my daughter, the older one, and we're going to travel the furthest distance on the planet Earth that you can, traveling only by train. And it's basically from Edinburgh, Scotland, all the way to Singapore. And you have to take lots of different trains, and it's going to take us a few months. But we're planning this trip, and I'm very curious as to how that is going to play out when we actually do it. And we're planning to do it in the next year or two, actually.
That is incredible. Was that your idea or her idea?
It's a mix. So, in Connectography, I talk about this sort of global infrastructure integration that's going on. And I mentioned this itinerary in the very beginning of the book. And so she started reading the first couple pages and was captivated by this. And she's like, well, why don't we do this? And I was like, oh my God, why don't I do it? And so obviously I have to do it with her.
I love it. I love the fact that she's reading your books. Very smart at a young age. So that's great. Some people might be afraid. You've got to document that journey. That would be fascinating perspective to see. All right.
Oh, we're definitely going to.
So, of course, you're a prolific author and you write a lot about, worldviews and viewpoints and geopolitical strategies. But if you had to write an autobiography about yourself, the title of the book would be?
Oh, that's easy. It's Paragistan. Because I spent so much time the last 20 years in countries that end in stan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, all of the stans. And so some people actually call me Paragistan. So when I do write my autobiography, I can't imagine it having any other title than that.
You would essentially be your own info state right there, given the amount that you have published.
There you go.
All right, next one for you. If you could invite 3 people over for dinner, dead or alive, who would you invite and what would you want to talk about?
Well, I'm a big Roger Federer fan, and the man has just clinched his 18th Grand Slam title. He is an absolute immortal hero. So transcending dead or alive, long may he live.
And people probably don't know this about you, but you were also a competitive tennis player yourself, right?
Yeah, I was. I mean, just a shadow of my former self. Although part of living in the tropics is getting my butt back in shape, and I do play a ton of tennis out here. But Federer, for sure. I mean, because obviously people at that level of talent, have insights about life that transcend a particular sport, and I think he deserves that degree of almost sort of, beatification that he's achieved. So let's go back a few centuries. Let's invite Genghis Khan in, carnivore that he surely was. Because, I've been fascinated, obviously, with Eurasia and the Silk Roads. And there's been great books that I've read over the years that explain how, in the process of conquest, what Genghis Khan did was to allow the Silk Roads to flourish. And, so much really since my first book 10 years ago, if there's one common thread, it actually is the Silk Road. I've been obsessed with this geography for my whole life. And so this is the man who conquered more of it than any other individual, before or since. So Genghis Khan, Roger Federer, now that is a strange conversation.
That's a strange combo. Would you invite a third?
There's a historical figure that's known to almost no one from the late 19th century. His name was Nicholas Roerich. He was a Russian sort of mystic Buddhist who actually there's a strong India connection. He retired to the Himalayas and became a sort of landscape painter. And the portrait of that hangs in the Indian parliament today, right now, was actually painted by him, by a Russian. And this is that man, Nicholas Roerich. He was a key figure in this 19th century Great Game, as it was known, which was, again, a very Silk Road story. The Great Game was the competition between Britain and Russia to control Central Asia. So, again, it was really about the geopolitics, the 19th century geopolitics of the Silk Road of Central Asia. He was a pivotal figure in all of that. And there's a lot that's speculated about him. There's a fair bit written about him. And I've written he's just one of these very cool guys, let's put it that way. Very interesting, insightful people who would have known a lot about the world in what was obviously a very interesting time, the kind of late 19th century. So yeah, Genghis Khan, Nicholas Roerich, and Roger Federer. There you go.
Fascinating pick of three.
Strangest dinner ever.
But you know what? Coming from me, that doesn't surprise me. That's a fascinating pick of three. All right. Last question for you. So on this podcast, we celebrate everything that makes us different, what makes us unique. That's something that we call unusual. So in your words, how would you fill in the blank? I'm unusual because...
Well, maybe it's not unusual for your cosmopolitan podcast, but I guess at the very beginning you called me a global citizen, and I'm actually trying to be that. There's no correct way or incorrect way to do that. But since, again, in all my books, what I try to do is to have you not know where I'm from, because the hardest part of being convincing is overcoming people's perception of your bias. And I've been aware of that since the very beginning. So I was born in India. I grew up a bit in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, then New York, and went to high school in Germany. And I've lived obviously I live in Singapore now, and I've lived basically all over the place. So I'm, really I try very hard to not just talk about what a global citizen, quote unquote, ought to be, but to be that person, to be as neutral as I can. That is perhaps all too unusual in this day and age, isn't it?
I think that's a perspective that I would love to dig in further. Now, of course, the topic of today's conversation was focused around the radical and unusual ideas around your restructuring of the government, which I thought was important enough to have its own episode. But I would love to have you back on the show to talk about your backstory, your influences, your upbringing, what's defined you as a global citizen. And I think there are some important lessons for everyone to hear regarding that. So if you're up for it, maybe we can reschedule and get another episode on to talk about your backstory.
Love to. This has been very fun.
So thank you, Parag, for being on the show. For those listening, I really encourage you to go pick out a copy of his book, Technocracy in America. We scratched the surface on some of the ideas that were in the book. There's a number of other ones that are extremely important that we didn't get to today. So go pick up a copy of that book. Parag, just for people listening, they wanted to learn more about you, about your work, your book, where they can pick up a copy, if they can see you on tour, where would you direct them to go?
Oh, well, everything is on www.paragkhanna.com. So, the book is on Kindle, so it's the fastest way to get it. I post a lot of articles there, facebook.com/Dr. Parag Khanna, Dr. Parag Khanna. So everything just goes up there all the time.
Great. And I know you've been doing a lot of Facebook Live episodes too, so it's be certain.
Those are good fun. Once they activate that live with feature where two people can do it at the same time, that'll be fun. We can do one of those.
Yeah, that would be a lot of fun. So great, Parag. So thank you so much. I know you're a busy guy. Thanks you for joining us on the call. Always a delight catching up with you and hearing your perspective. Thank you.
Likewise. Great to talk to you too.
Hi again, it's me, Dr. G. If you are still listening, I'm hoping it's because you enjoyed this podcast. If you would like to hear future episodes, you could really help me out by subscribing to the That's Unusual podcast on iTunes and leaving a review. It goes a long way in helping me get the word out from avid listeners like you. As a thank you, I will be selecting one new reviewer each week at random for a free private 15-minute phone conversation where you can ask me anything. and get professional advice on your career or business to help you stand out and make a difference. Also, if you want to be notified of any future episodes, please visit that'sunusualpodcast.com and sign up to receive updates on new episode releases. Until next time, remember to always think unusual.